All right, guys. Today we're going to talk a little bit about immigration and urbanization. As you've kind of dove into your hyperdoc, hopefully you've done a pretty good job of investigating some of these things already, as you've been looking at the different graphs and charts and recognize that um, the immigrants were flooding into America from all over the world, and that certainly there were different feelings toward immigrants as time went on. We're going to go through some of that today. I'll show you a couple more graphs and charts, and we're going to talk about really the impact on cities as a result of immigration. All right, so I like this graph or this pie chart, excuse me, because it really I think you can visually see how rapidly America grows. So you can see the population here in 1870, and the size of that population was roughly 12.9 million people in the labor force. That's not the entire population; that's adult working people. For the most part, of course, child labor was also a problem at this point. But usually we're talking kids that are, you know, around 10 years old who would be considered in this labor force. But by 1910, we're looking at the population growing to about 36.7 million people, and you can see a shift, right? So you can see that shift to manufacturing, construction, a little bit bigger jump there. You see mining goes up. We'll talk about that as we get into the West. You see commerce growing tremendously as more and more stores, especially department stores in major cities, are created. But the number of people generally goes up, and a lot of agriculture is going to kind of fall by the wayside as these other things grow, which kind of ties in. And I think this graph was even in the last set of notes, kind of telling you a little bit about what America was like during this time period. But that number, it grows as a result of immigration, and this is in your hyperdoc. But you can see where these people are coming from. The majority of them are coming from places like Germany and Italy. Of course, we had a lot of that migration early in this period, especially when we had the potato famine. We had a lot of Irish come in. These are a lot of our Catholic ancestors coming in here from Germany and Ireland into America during this period. But then you'll also see that that number extends into more Eastern Europeans as well. You have the Polish. We have 2 million Jews coming into the country as well. And so there's a lot of different people from Europe coming in. But predominantly the biggest groups are the Germans and the Italian, or the Irish, excuse me, coming in from Western Germany. It's when you start to see Italians, Polish people, and Jewish people coming into the country that there becomes a little bit more pushback, as they are not that Protestant or even just Christian white Americans coming in. It causes some issues. But we also notice that there is some immigration coming in from China and Japan. That kind of dates back all the way to the gold rush era. For those of you who remember reading in the text about Chinese people coming over to California during the gold rush, hoping to get rich. A lot of those immigrants will continue to stay and work building the Transcontinental Railroad during this time. So certainly they're worth mentioning as well, and they're going to see a lot of pushback as well. So in both cases, you've got people coming into all parts of the country. You also see immigration from Mexico included on this map as well there in the middle. But immigration was coming from everywhere, and the number of people was growing rapidly, the population more or less tripling. And you can kind of see what this looks like over time, that in the beginning it's mostly Northern and Western Europeans. But if you notice those political cartoons in your hyperdoc, around 1890, there's a transition where that feeling of welcoming immigrants, which was kind of this old immigration, kind of crosses paths with that new immigration, those Southern and Eastern Europeans, those Polish people, people from Italy. When it shifts over and a lot more of those people start coming over, there becomes a lot more of a resistance to immigration. So there's definitely a racial component to that, and it ties in very much with social Darwinism that we talked about in class, that these people were looked at as inferior, that these these particular groups were not as evolved as the Western and Northern Europeans, where the majority of immigrants had come from before, where a lot of the ancestors from this country have come from before. So there's certainly a different viewpoint of those people. So I think seeing that on a graph really helps kind of drive that point home. When immigrants arrived in America, if they were coming from Europe, they would come in through New York. You've probably heard of Ellis Island. In many cases, they would come in through New York. Some places they would come in through Boston and other places, but the majority of people came in through Ellis Island. And only if you were a first or second class citizen, so if you were an upper class person, you were allowed basically in right away. If you were not, you were kind of held for a little bit. You were put through inspections. But really, most people were allowed into the country. Again, the need for people to work was certainly pulling people into America, and that was a big deal. You're gonna have a chance to look at push and pull factors. Your text definitely goes into that. I'm not gonna go into all of that, but certainly the need for industrial workers pulled people in. So there was very little resistance put up here, especially early on. And like I said, that definitely changes over time. But Ellis Island, the process took a couple hours, and then you were cleared if you cleared your medical inspection, you entered the country. In the West Coast, if you were coming from Asia, there would be a difference. You would come in through Angel Island, and this was actually kind of more of a resistance. It was more built to filter out Asian immigrants than it was to let them in. And people could get stuck in Angel Island for months. So as opposed to the couple hours you would spend in Ellis Island, you could be held in Angel Island for months and then ultimately denied immigration. The reason for this, I asked the question here in the notes, why is the difference between Asian and European immigrants? A lot of it's just racially motivated, that especially those Northern and Western Europeans were welcomed with open arms, whereas Asians, they look different. There was less jobs on the West Coast, so there was more competition for those jobs, as industrialization really hadn't made its way all the way to the West yet. And so there was just a general disinterest in Asian immigration. And so you'll see that the process was much slower to try to discourage Asian immigration to the West, although it can't be understated the importance that Chinese immigration played in building the Transcontinental Railroad. They were incredibly hard workers, and without them, the Transcontinental Railroad would not have been built by 1869 for sure. It would have taken far longer using European immigration, especially on the process of building it from the west to the east. So we certainly don't want to understate the importance of Chinese immigrants coming in, but recognizing that people in the West were not welcoming those immigrants with open arms. And with that kind of comes this idea of nativism. And I didn't put the political cartoon in the notes because it was in the hyperdoc, but that second document, that second political cartoon that's in your hyperdoc, where it shows the people extending their arms saying, no, we don't want you here. You're not welcome at all. That was kind of the feeling from 1890 on the East Coast, in places like New York, where you started seeing the American Protective Association develop organizations trying to lobby to get legislation passed to block immigration. In California, you had the Working Man's Party of California, which wanted to limit Chinese immigration. And in fact, they were successful when in 1882, they got the Chinese Exclusion Act passed, which actually banned any new Chinese immigration for 10 years. So there was certainly a sense that once the jobs were being taken and competition for those jobs went way up and the cost of labor went down, working class people wanted to limit immigration. And if you think about immigration even today, that's really what it boils down to. A lot of people look at immigration. Yes, there's a racial component to it, but for the most part, it's an economic component, in my opinion, in that people realize that if they're competing for jobs with outsiders, that it's going to drive down wages. And many of these people did not want to see their wages impacted, especially in places like California, where I said they did not have as many jobs available. So regardless, though, of all this immigration talk, people make their way to America. And what generally happens here is that you're going to see a transition begin to take place. And I'm actually going to skip ahead and note one slide real quick, and I'll come back. But when you look at this, what's happening here from 1860, so the beginning of the Civil War on, you start to see this growth in the urban, this darker line, the urban population of the United States. So the rural population is going to be growing as well because there's just more people. But you're going to see we're going to slowly transition to the point by the 1920s, we're going to actually have more people living in cities than we have living in rural areas. And that begins here. And it begins for two reasons. Number one, the immigrants who come here, so that big flood of immigration, when they come here, most of them are too poor to move. So they get stuck in cities like New York or Boston, and they start living in areas where they can live close to their work. And that work is in low-paying factories, and they don't have the opportunity to gain more money and get out. I mean, if you almost think about like an industrial worker as a sharecropper that we talked about during the era of Reconstruction for African Americans, they kind of get stuck in a cycle where they're constantly in debt and they have no real social mobility. So immigrants kind of find themselves stuck in cities, helping the population of cities grow rapidly. But also rural Americans, cities, number one, are going to offer a lot of those technological innovations that we talked about in the last section. They're going to have them a lot quicker than rural areas, but things like plumbing and electricity. There's going to be entertainment. You're going to start to see the development of like professional sports, like baseball will get started during this time. You're going to start seeing movies, Broadway shows. All those things are going to be available in cities that you don't have in rural areas. On top of that, the demand for farmers is going to go way down because we have machinery like the tractor or the combine that are going to be created during this time as well. They're going to make it less likely that you're going to make a good living being a farmer. So the demand for farmers is going to go down. So that agricultural aspect that we saw in that pie chart it's going to push people to go find jobs doing other things, whether that's working in industrial factories or possibly moving up into the new American middle class and working in like management positions or being doctors or lawyers or something like that, where it allows you to have more opportunities. So cities were attracting people, both immigrants and rural Americans. So cities were certainly growing. And you can see this again in the graph that was in the hyperdoc. You see the population, the red circles here on these populations were the population in 1880, and then by 1900, how much more they've grown. And so you can kind of see that these populations, the bigger circles, a place like New York, would have over 2 million people by 1900. Places like Philadelphia, Boston, we're talking, if not a million, close to 1 million people in those cities. Chicago is going to emerge, usually as the classic case study of this period in American history, seeing Chicago go from a very small area to a much bigger, really predominant city. And I know I showed this in the first set of notes, but I'm going to bring it up again because Chicago is a great example. And like I said, usually becomes a good case study for this time period because it's kind of the perfect example of a city. Most of these cities are springing up around waterways and railroad lines because at the end of the day, these cities are really being formed as centers of industry. That's the whole point of this unit, is that there's a bunch of industry. Well, if you make stuff, you need to be able to get that stuff to market. It's just like what we talked about prior to the Civil War and why things like the War of 1812 happened. If you remember back to that, people needed ways to control like the rivers back then. That was the predominant way of moving materials, was through like the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. Well, now we've got new methods. Rivers are still incredibly important. So waterways certainly are going to be the foundations for a lot of cities. But now with the invention of the railroad, you're going to be able to see cities spring up in other places. And Chicago is kind of like the perfect spot because it's both. It's on Lake Michigan, so it has water access. And through canals and things, you're able to connect the Great Lakes all the way to the East Coast. But it's also going to be a major railroad hub in this new connected America. So it's going to be like in a perfect place to connect the West, where you're going to see a lot of things like cattle being raised for meat. So you're going to see a lot of meat packing industries in Chicago. But it's also close enough to the east that there's a magnet for people there. So there's going to be a huge market. So there's a little bit of everything in Chicago. So it's a perfect city. So you can see it growing from 1820 as just a nothing, like little like Indians living there, undeveloped part of the country to by 1854 emerging as a relatively large city to by 1898 being an enormous city to today being one of the three biggest cities in the United States. And if you've driven through Chicago, the traffic backs that up, that it's a big, busy, bustling city where there's a lot of industry. The steel industry certainly had a big role to play here during this time, and just a lot of commerce in general taking place in Chicago. So within these new cities, there's some things that are unique to these places that are worth pointing out. The first thing is architecture, things that we would say would be the definition of American architecture: skyscrapers, bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge, all of these things that are made of steel. That becomes kind of the American calling card for our architecture. I already mentioned popular entertainment, places, baseball games, Broadway musicals, places like the name just went out of my mind. Places like Coney Island, where people could go for like amusement parks. That all started springing up during this time. And one of the big things that happens in these cities is this idea of conspicuous consumption, that people are buying things just to be buying things. The consumerism becomes a trend. Like the whole idea of advertising to people because they need new products that they had never heard of before. The world had not changed for basically the last 300 years. No one is really doing things any differently if you live in rural America. But when you get into these cities, all of a sudden there's all these new inventions with electricity and irons, like to get the wrinkles out of your clothes, and washing machines and refrigerators. People didn't even know that they needed these things, and they're being convinced that they need them through things like marketing and advertising, trying to get people to be consumers. Department stores are going to spring up all over the place. Things like Macy's, Bloomingdale's, Saks Fifth Avenue are going to pop up to try to sell people all this new industrial stuff. So those are all big things that pop up within cities. Also, to try to get people moved around from their homes to work, you're going to see mass transit, subways in Boston and New York, the L train in Chicago. In San Francisco, you're going to see things like cable cars and trolleys to help move people along. Here is the boardwalk, outside of Coney Island, where people would go and they would enjoy their time on the beach. The whole concept of even having vacation time was a new idea for a lot of these people, that they had leisure time. Remember, most people, if you live on a farm, you work from sun up to sunset. So this is a new idea that you're able to go out and enjoy yourself and go to these places and spend your money. We talked a lot about low wages, but certainly that middle class that emerges in America during this time is going to have disposable income for the first time. Like, that's a new concept, disposable income, things that you're not required to spend money on, but you can spend money on. It's not like your normal living. So like going to the beach and going to an amusement park would be something that people could do. Again, here's just skyscrapers that you would see in New York. And there's some really cool pictures, especially as we get closer to the 1920s. In these cities, they were still using horses and buggies. There's going to be a time when the automobile and Henry Ford, we start to see those cars on the road as the same time as horse and buggies. And we start to see that transition time right now between the old way of doing things, the old way of using transportation, and the new modern way of doing things. So cities become kind of the center for that, like where you get to see, like, there's still outhouses that people use in the cities, but there's also indoor plumbing. So there's a lot of like crossovers between the old and the new that you don't necessarily get in rural America, where it was very stagnant even still at this point. Here's the inside of a New York subway. Again, kind of identifying some of the finest architecture in America at this point, with like the tiled subways, really elaborate, well-designed, but ornate places. Like the subway wasn't just transportation. Like you go to Grand Central Station in New York, it's an experience. It was not just designed to be useful. It was designed to look spectacular. And that was a part of American architecture during this time. Here's the L train in Chicago. If you've been to Chicago, you've most likely seen these trains, but they didn't have the infrastructure to build the subways, so most of their trains are above ground. Within these cities, you would have a very clear distinction between where people lived. So at this point in American history, because transportation was still fairly dated, the rich people would actually live in the middle of the town. So like downtown was the place to live. Places like Fifth Avenue in New York City, where you would see, I'm going to skip ahead for a second here, but you would see mansions like this. This is Fifth Avenue in New York, where you would see like a Rockefeller's mansion. And again, kind of the busy shopping area. Here's Saks Fifth Avenue, where you could go and buy your furs and buy your fancy clothes. This was an exclusive part of town near Broadway, so that you were able to go to the shows. So the rich people were living certainly in luxury. The middle class tended to live on the outside of the city. They didn't have the money to live in the heart, but they also wanted to get away from work. So they would live in what were called streetcar suburbs. Sorry, that's the inside of some of those rich mansions. But here's a streetcar suburb where you can kind of see these houses with yards. These middle class families had enough money to go get out of the town a little bit, live in almost like a subdivision, and then be able to ride the public transportation, ride the train into work on a given day. So they had enough money to do that, but not quite wealthy enough to live in those exclusive downtown mansions or in a penthouse or something. So they were outside of town. And then finally, the last group there would live in tenements, dark, crowded, multifamily apartments, where they were kind of jamming people in. And like I said, multifamily apartments, that would be the case. Like you would see people living in, you'd have huge families living in like a one-room studio apartment. These places were dirty. They were often unventilated. Fires would break out a lot. Some of them had electricity with bad wiring. Some of them didn't have electricity, so people were using candles. If you could imagine candles being lit in a place like this. They were very dangerous, though. People would die of inhalation. They would of like smoke inhalation. There would also be situations where there would be like a shared bathroom between like an entire floor of people. And so they were very unsanitary and in no way healthy, but it's about all these people could afford. And if you read in that section of your hyperdoc with How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis, he kind of describes what it's like to live in these conditions. Now, all that said, with all these different groups, one thing that you can certainly point to that happens within these cities is that the standard of living goes way up. Now, I just showed you those tenements, and it'd be hard pressed for you to, for me to convince you that those places are good living conditions, and I wouldn't ever try to make that argument. But what I would say is those people who are mostly immigrants who are coming and choosing to live in those environments would choose that again if they were given the opportunity, because it was still better than what they were escaping in Europe. Again, I'm not going to go into all the push and pull factors. You can read that in your text. But what they were escaping in Europe, whether that was mandatory service in the armed forces or famine or other things, the standard of living for these people, even though it's bad, was still going up. And so you see like food prices falling, cost of living falling, or at the very least staying relatively consistent. So this tells you that generally life for all people was getting better, even in these terrible conditions. But certainly if you were wealthy, you could make a very comfortable living during this time period. Here's one last shot that I almost left off. With people using outhouses outside of a tenement, so they didn't even have indoor plumbing in their tenements. And slumlords were common. Again, in that article by Jacob Riis, you hear him talking about like the guy who gets to make $8,000, renting out these 25-cent rooms to people and not worrying about upkeep or anything because they have no better place to go. And there was really no regulation on making sure that apartments were held to any kind of code. At least not at first. As I said in class, like this is a time period where the rules and regulations did not keep up with the influx of people very well. It's going to take time for this transition and these rules to like catch up with what was happening. So finally here, I want to mention this as the city, as these cities are growing, they become kind of a new frontier in America. We haven't talked about the West yet, But the West has always been looked at in America as kind of the frontier area where if life was rough, you could always just pack up and move west. You could go out and get some cheap land, and you could go live and start your life all over. You could go be a cowboy or whatever. Well, during this period, the West is going to get closed off. The government's going to start selling that land off in big quantities, where you'll be able to get huge tracts of land. And after the Oklahoma land rush, really, there's no more just cheap land available in the West. So the frontier will, in many ways, be closed in terms of looking at it as the West, but the city itself is going to be a new frontier for some people. So people who can no longer escape to the West to start a new life will try to escape to cities to start a new life. And so, as I already mentioned, architectural styles will be new, different, American, tall skyscrapers, bridges, those subways that I mentioned. They're using space, again, skyscrapers, in ways that have never been used before. There's going to be class diversity, people of different social classes living together, even though they're separated within the city, they're all in the city together. So you have a certain level of diversity. Another thing that I didn't mention about cities is a lot of these immigrants, they would segregate themselves within these cities. So you would have like a Chinatown where Chinese immigrants would go. You'd have Little Italy where Italian immigrants would go. You would have like little German towns. You would have, I don't know, just all these different places where immigrants would kind of collect near each other. And it's also why in the Catholic faith, why you would see like Irish churches and German churches in the same town or in the same city. And you wouldn't see any crossover between those churches. Like they would just go to the one of their nationality, even though they're all Catholic churches. But there was a lot of separation of things. So even though there was diversity, there was also like self-imposed segregation in a lot of these places. There's new energy, both in terms of actual energy like electricity, but also the energy of a city. If you've been to one of these big cities, if you've been to a Chicago or a New York, you felt that energy when you were there, I'm sure. It's just a different level because of the amount of people that are there. It's always just busy feeling. And for some people that's stressful, but other people like embrace that that energy, that electricity that you feel in a city. New culture, as all these cultures do come together, again, even though they're kind of segregated out, we get this idea of the melting pot that America is kind of known for. There is a blending of culture over time. You get this new form of rugged individualism, something that America has always been known for. If you're going to make it in a city, you have to have some ruggedness about you. It's a dangerous place. There's a lot of crime in a city, so you have to be able to kind of stand up for yourself. And I think Jay-Z said it. If you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. I have to usually quote Jay-Z in my notes, but that's kind of a sense of that rugged individualism. I mentioned crime, violence, and corruption. We'll definitely come back and talk about corruption as we move on. But cities can give you a chance to make a fresh start. And certainly they will become the symbol of change and progress in America, as some of the first attempts to solve some of the problems of the Gilded Age will take place within cities. So that's it for this section here about cities and about immigration. If you have questions about your hyperdoc or about what we've talked about today, please talk to me during class, and I'll look forward to hearing your responses on Flipgrid.